My daughter threw wine in my face after I refused to sell my car to fund her luxury trip. This is the story of a father who gave everything to his daughter until one dinner changed everything. A glass of wine, a cruel demand, and a final decision that would lead him to freedom on the coast of Italy. Before we dive in, hit subscribe so you don't miss any of these powerful family stories, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to see how far Edward's journey reaches. Edward Mitchell was 72 years old, but there was still a spark in his eyes that time had not managed to dim. His small, tidy house sat on the edge of a quiet suburban street, the kind of place where the days rolled by gently. Since losing his wife, Margaret, 5 years earlier, the silence of the house had grown heavy. Still, Edward found comfort in the familiar scent of polished wood, the ticking of the grandfather clock, and the soft rustle of old photo albums he often leafed through on rainy afternoons. In the garage, however, lived the heart of Edward's past, a bright red 1969 Pontiac GTO. The paint shone like fresh candy apples, and the chrome trim reflected light like a mirror. Every curve, every line of that car carried a story. He and his late brother William had spent 2 full years restoring it from a rusted, forgotten shell into a roaring beauty. For Edward, it wasn't just a car. It was the last tangible link to both his brother and the days when life felt whole. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Edward would sit in the driver's seat without even starting the engine. He'd run his fingers over the leather steering wheel, remembering the laughter and arguments he and William shared while working under the hood. They had skinned their knuckles on bolts, stayed up late hunting for rare parts, and celebrated small victories with cheap beer. Each scratch on the frame, each faint smell of gasoline felt like a chapter of his life, etched into steel and chrome. Margaret had loved the car too. She would sit in the passenger seat during Sunday drives, a scarf tied around her hair, smiling as the wind teased at the edges. The GTO had been part of their courtship, their weekend getaways, and even their arguments. Like the time she teased him about polishing the car more often than he cooked dinner. Every mile they drove together was now a treasured memory locked inside Edward's heart. Since her passing, the car had remained in perfect condition. Edward treated it almost like a living thing, checking its oil regularly, polishing it until it gleamed, and starting it up once a week just to hear the deep, satisfying rumble of the engine. It was a ritual that kept him grounded, a reminder that some parts of life could still run smoothly, no matter how much time passed. Neighbors knew about Edward's attachment to the GTO. Some admired it from afar. Others had tried, unsuccessfully, to buy it from him. "Not for sale," he would say with a polite smile, never revealing the depth of his sentiment. To most people, it was just a vintage car worth a lot of money. To Edward, it was a family heirloom, even if no one in his family seemed to value it the way he did. On that particular week, Edward felt more nostalgic than usual. The weather had turned warm, and the blooming scent of lilacs drifted into the garage. He sat in the car with the driver's door open, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the sunlight brush across his face. He thought of William's deep laugh, Margaret's warm hand on his arm, and the countless roads they had traveled. He didn't know it yet, but this car, his most treasured possession, was about to become the center of a storm he never saw coming. Melissa Mitchell was 34 years old and had grown up in a world where comfort was the norm. As Edward's only child, she had never known the kind of hardships he and William faced in their youth. Her childhood had been filled with birthday parties, brand new clothes, and vacations to sunny beaches. Edward, still carrying the scars of his own modest upbringing, had sworn early in life that his daughter would never want for anything, and he had kept that promise, perhaps to her detriment. From the moment Melissa learned how to drive, her father had been there to pay for her car, her insurance, and even her parking tickets. When she moved into her first apartment, Edward was the one who covered the deposit and bought her furniture. When she wanted to start her own business, he handed over a generous loan he never asked her to repay. Over the years, the unspoken rule between them became clear. If Melissa fell into trouble, Edward would quietly fix it. Melissa did work, at least in the technical sense. She had a marketing job at a mid-sized firm, but her salary barely covered her lifestyle. Designer handbags, expensive dinners, weekend getaways with friends. Her tastes far exceeded her paycheck. Whenever her bank account dipped too low, she'd call her father, her tone softening as she explained some unexpected expense she couldn't cover. Edward, soft-hearted and unwilling to see her struggle, would always help. To her friends, Melissa was the picture of modern independence. She lived in a stylish apartment, drove a sleek SUV, and seemed to have money for every whim. Few knew that behind her image of self-sufficiency was a safety net made entirely of her father's sacrifices. Melissa had grown to see this support not as a privilege, but as something she was entitled to. Edward's love and generosity had become, in her eyes, an unlimited resource. Though Edward never complained, he sometimes wondered if he'd made a mistake. Late at night, sitting alone with a cup of tea, he'd think about how Melissa had never learned the value of earning something for herself. But those thoughts were quickly buried under his paternal instinct. He told himself that Margaret would have wanted their daughter to be happy and safe. And so, every time Melissa asked for help, Edward gave it. But recently, he had begun to notice a sharper edge to her tone. The sweet requests were becoming demands. Melissa no longer seemed grateful. She seemed impatient. If Edward hesitated to transfer money or questioned her spending, she would sigh heavily, as though she were dealing with someone unreasonable. It stung, but he brushed it off, convincing himself she was simply stressed. What Edward didn't know was that Melissa had her sights set on something big. A luxury trip with her closest friends, complete with first-class flights, a 5-star resort, and all the indulgences money could buy. It was the kind of trip she couldn't possibly afford on her own, and in her mind, she already knew exactly who was going to pay for it. When Melissa called Edward earlier that week to invite him over for dinner, his heart had lifted. It wasn't often that his daughter reached out simply to spend time together. She had sounded cheerful, even affectionate over the phone, saying she wanted to catch up like old times. Edward pictured them laughing over a home-cooked meal, perhaps reminiscing about Margaret's legendary roast chicken, or the holidays they'd spent together when Melissa was still a child. The thought warmed him, and he agreed immediately. On the evening of the dinner, Edward took care to dress neatly, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and the cologne Margaret had once loved. He stopped at a small wine shop on the way and picked out a bottle of Merlot. Not the cheapest, but not overly extravagant either. Something that would pair well with almost any meal. At the bakery across the street, he selected a box of her favorite lemon tarts, remembering how she used to sneak extra slices when she thought no one was looking. Melissa's apartment was in a sleek modern building downtown. As Edward walked into the marble-floored lobby, he couldn't help but notice the contrast to the modest home he lived in. The elevator ride to the 12th floor felt almost ceremonial, as though he was stepping into a different world. When she opened the door, she greeted him with a quick smile and a hug that felt slightly rushed. Warm enough to be polite, but missing the depth he had hoped for. Inside, her dining table was set elegantly, with polished silverware and tall wine glasses. The apartment smelled faintly of rosemary and garlic, though Edward suspected most of the meal had been ordered from a high-end restaurant. Still, he appreciated the effort, and his heart swelled as he handed her the wine and the dessert. She thanked him, placing the bottle on the counter without looking closely at the label, as if it were just another formality. As they sat down, Edward tried to steer the conversation toward family memories. He spoke about the summer they had gone camping by the lake, the time William had nearly tipped the canoe, and how Margaret had laughed until tears rolled down her cheeks. Melissa smiled faintly at the stories, but her eyes kept drifting toward her phone on the table, screen lighting up with incoming messages. It was clear her mind was elsewhere. The food was delicious, though Edward noticed Melissa didn't seem particularly hungry. She picked at her plate between glances at her phone, occasionally nodding at whatever he was saying. Edward told himself not to take it personally. Young people, he thought, were always busy. Still, a small pang of disappointment settled in his chest. This wasn't quite the evening of connection he had imagined. Then, just as he was pouring the wine, Melissa finally set her phone down and looked at him with a practiced, almost hesitant smile. "Dad," she began, her tone gentle but deliberate, "there's actually something I wanted to talk to you about tonight." Edward's heart lifted again, thinking maybe she wanted to share some personal news. But deep down, a faint unease began to stir. Melissa swirled the wine in her glass, her eyes brightening suddenly, as if she'd been waiting for the right moment. "So," she began, leaning forward slightly, "I've been planning something exciting." Edward smiled politely, setting his fork down to give her his full attention. She launched into the story with growing enthusiasm, describing how she and 3 of her closest friends had decided to take a long-overdue girls' trip. Her voice carried a spark that had been missing earlier in the evening, and Edward couldn't help but be pleased to see her so animated. She painted vivid pictures of the itinerary: cobblestone streets in Paris, gondola rides in Venice, private wine tastings in Tuscany. "We've been researching for weeks," she said, almost breathless. "We're talking 5-star hotels, the best restaurants, exclusive guided tours. The whole thing will be unforgettable." Edward listened, nodding, imagining the colorful postcards such a journey would bring to life. For a moment, it felt like an ordinary conversation between father and daughter, sharing dreams over dinner. But then she added, almost as an afterthought, "We just need a little help to make it happen." Her tone was casual, but Edward caught the shift. "We've already picked the dates, booked the preliminary holds on the hotels. We just need to put down the deposits to lock everything in. I've almost got my share, but—" She trailed off, giving him a small, knowing smile that made his stomach tighten. Edward, still unsure of where this was going, asked gently, "How much are we talking about here?" Melissa glanced at her wine glass instead of meeting his eyes. "Well, with everything included, flights, accommodations, tours, and spending money, it's about $20,000 for my part." She said it quickly, as though speed might soften the impact. Edward blinked, taken aback. That was more than he'd spent on his entire wedding to Margaret. Trying to keep his voice neutral, he asked, "And you can cover how much of that yourself?" Melissa shrugged lightly, as if the number were unimportant. "Not much, honestly. I've been stretched thin with bills lately, but I figured, you've always been there for me. And this trip, Dad, it's not just a vacation. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience." She smiled again, this time with an almost rehearsed sweetness. Edward felt a mixture of emotions, pride that his daughter had such ambitions, but also a flicker of concern about her expectations. He had worked hard his entire life, saved carefully, and every dollar he had left was tied to security in his old age. The idea of handing over such a large sum for a luxury trip sat uneasily in his mind. Still, he didn't want to dampen her excitement just yet. Melissa continued to gush about the details: the Michelin-starred restaurants, the rooftop bars overlooking the Eiffel Tower, the shopping districts in Milan. Edward listened quietly, nodding at the right moments, though his thoughts were beginning to drift toward the question he didn't want to ask himself. Was this invitation to dinner really about spending time together, or had it been about something else all along? Melissa topped off her wineglass before speaking again, her voice light but calculated. "You know, Dad," she began, swirling the deep red liquid lazily, "there's actually a really simple way to make this happen." Edward looked up from his plate, curious but cautious. "You almost never use that old Pontiac in the garage. I mean, it's just sitting there collecting dust." The casualness in her tone was almost disarming, but Edward felt his chest tighten. She set her glass down and smiled, as if she'd just solved a harmless puzzle. "You could sell it, Dad. Think about it. That thing has to be worth a fortune. I'm sure a collector would pay top dollar for it." You'd have more than enough to cover my trip and still have cash left over. It's the perfect solution." Her eyes lit up, as if she expected him to agree instantly, like this was a favor so small it barely needed discussion. Edward blinked slowly, his fork frozen mid-air. "Melissa," he said carefully, "that's not just a car." His voice carried an edge he rarely used with her. "It's a piece of my life. Your uncle and I restored it together. We spent years on it, every bolt, every coat of paint. It's..." He stopped himself, realizing his words might fall on deaf ears. The sentimental weight behind the Pontiac was something Melissa had never seemed to understand. She leaned back in her chair, clearly impatient. "I get that it has history, but Dad, it's still just an object. You can't drive history. You can't pay bills with memories. And honestly, you're not exactly taking road trips anymore, are you?" The dismissiveness in her tone cut deeper than she realized. Edward stared at her, trying to read if this was thoughtless immaturity or a deliberate attempt to guilt him. Melissa's voice softened, but her eyes held a sharp focus. "Please, Dad. You've always helped me when I needed it. I've never asked for something like this before. This trip is important to me, and I don't see any other way to make it happen. You wouldn't even miss that car." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with entitlement. Edward felt a pang of sadness, not just from the request itself, but from the way she had reduced something priceless to him into nothing more than a bargaining chip. He thought of all the evenings he and his brother had spent in that garage, the smell of engine oil, the laughter, the music playing on an old radio. Selling the car wasn't just selling metal, it was selling the last tangible link to those days. For a moment, neither spoke. Melissa tapped her nails lightly against her wineglass, waiting for an answer. Edward took a slow sip of water, his gaze steady but unreadable. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew his answer, but he also knew Melissa wasn't going to like it, and something told him she wasn't the type to let it go quietly. Edward set his fork down, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Melissa," he began, his voice calm but firm, "that car is special to me. It's not about money." She frowned, her lips tightening as if she had expected him to say yes without hesitation. He continued, "It's the last thing your uncle and I worked on together. Every time I see it, I remember the summers we spent in the garage, laughing, arguing, fixing it piece by piece." His gaze drifted for a moment as if lost in the memory. Melissa leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "Dad, I'm not asking you to give away the car to a stranger for free. You'd be getting money for it. Enough to help me and maybe even fix up the house." Her tone had a mix of pleading and impatience, but Edward shook his head slowly, a small, sad smile tugging at his lips. "Some things can't be replaced with money, Melissa. This is one of them." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "So you're telling me you'd rather keep an old car in the garage than help your only daughter go on the trip of a lifetime?" The accusation in her voice was sharp, almost rehearsed. Edward didn't flinch. "I'm telling you that some memories are worth more than any trip," he replied evenly. Melissa crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. "You've always been sentimental, Dad, but you're not getting any younger. At some point, all that history you talk about will just sit there. No one will care about it when you're gone." Edward's jaw tightened at her words, but he refused to raise his voice. "Maybe so," he said quietly. "But until then, I care. And that's enough for me." For a few moments, the only sounds in the room were the soft clink of cutlery from the other guests and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Melissa's expression hardened, the playful, persuasive tone gone. "Fine," she said finally, pushing her plate away. "If that's how you feel, then I guess I'll have to figure it out myself." Edward felt a pang of guilt, but also a quiet resolve. He had spent a lifetime working hard, sacrificing for Melissa and giving whenever she needed. This wasn't about being selfish. It was about holding on to something that mattered deeply. Still, a part of him worried about how she would react now that she hadn't gotten her way. As Melissa poured herself another glass of wine, Edward noticed the way her hands moved, quick, tense, almost trembling. Something told him this conversation wasn't over, and if he was right, the night was about to take a turn he wouldn't soon forget. Melissa didn't give up easily. After Edward's calm refusal, she pushed her plate aside and leaned closer, her voice dropping into a tone she often used when trying to get her way. "Dad, you've had your time with that car," she said. "You rebuilt it, you drove it, you cherished the memories, but now it's just sitting there. Isn't it time you did something useful with it?" Her words stung, but Edward remained composed. He knew where this was going. "You think holding onto that rusty old car honors Uncle Frank?" she continued, her eyes fixed on him. "He's gone, you're alone, and I'm your family now. I need your help, not a museum piece in your garage." Edward blinked, taken aback by how coldly she spoke about the past. He sighed, quietly lifting his glass of water, trying to hide the tremble in his hand. "I've always helped you when you needed it," he said gently. "But there are limits, Melissa. That car, it's part of who I am." She rolled her eyes, scoffing. "Part of who you were, Dad. Not who you are now. You're retired. You sit at home. That car's the only thing you have left from that life. But it's not your life anymore." Edward set down his glass and looked at her, finally letting the sadness show in his eyes. "Is that really how you see me?" he asked. "As a burden? A washed-up old man clinging to a useless machine?" Melissa didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up her wine glass and took a long sip, avoiding his gaze. Then she said, "I'm just saying, memories don't pay bills. Nostalgia doesn't buy plane tickets. But selling that car, that would actually mean something." Her voice had grown harder now, more desperate. It was clear she felt entitled, like his possessions were hers to bargain with. "You know," she added with a bitter chuckle, "when Mom passed, I thought you'd grow up. Move on. Start thinking about the people still here." Edward's mouth tightened. The mention of his late wife, especially in that tone, struck a nerve, but he remained still, not willing to fuel the fire. "I've always been here," he replied quietly. "Maybe not the way you wanted, but I gave you everything I had. I just didn't expect one day you'd ask me to give up a piece of my soul." That silence returned, thick and heavy, hanging over the table. Melissa didn't like silence. She was used to getting what she wanted through words, pressure, guilt, but Edward wasn't budging this time, and that's when her patience began to unravel. The wine in her glass sloshed slightly as she gripped it harder, her jaw clenched, her knuckles white. Edward saw it coming. Not the exact moment, but the tension in the air was enough. This wasn't just disappointment. It was entitlement boiling into rage. The clinking of cutlery against plates had slowed. What was once cheerful conversation around Melissa's dining room table turned into an uncomfortable silence. Edward noticed the eyes of the other guests. A few of Melissa's friends and their partners flicking nervously between father and daughter. The warmth from earlier in the evening had drained from the room. Even the soft jazz playing in the background felt out of place now. Edward offered a polite smile to one guest, who quickly looked away. He knew everyone could feel it. The shift, the weight of what was unspoken. Melissa, sitting with perfect posture and clutching her wineglass like a gavel, took another sharp sip. Her expression hardened as Edward attempted to move the conversation elsewhere. "So, how's work treating you, Dan?" he asked Melissa's friend at the other end of the table. Dan opened his mouth to respond, but Melissa cut in, loud enough to override him. "We're not done here, Dad," she said flatly, setting her glass down a little too hard. The sound echoed slightly, pulling all attention back to her. Edward sighed quietly. He'd hoped the moment had passed, that perhaps the evening could still be salvaged. "Melissa," he said gently, "this isn't the time." She folded her arms and leaned back. "No, I think it is," she replied. "Everyone here knows how generous you've been with me my whole life. So maybe they should hear why you suddenly think your precious car matters more than your daughter's future." A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "You're twisting this," Edward said, his tone still composed. "I've never said I wouldn't support you, but I won't give up something that means so much to me just to fund a vacation." Melissa laughed bitterly. "A vacation? Is that what you think this is? This trip could be life-changing for me. Networking, exposure, rest, something I actually deserve." Her voice rose, sharp and defensive. "Deserve?" Edward asked, eyebrows lifting. "You live in a luxury condo. You eat at restaurants I can't pronounce. I've helped you buy 2 cars. And now you expect me to throw away the last thing I share with your uncle, just so you can sip champagne in Paris." The silence at the table grew even heavier. No one dared speak. A fork dropped and clattered on a plate. Melissa's jaw clenched. She slammed her hand on the table, startling several guests. "I can't believe you're making me beg," she snapped. "You always said you'd do anything for me. But now, the moment I ask for something real, something meaningful, you act like I'm asking for your blood." Edward inhaled slowly, trying to remain calm. "I've done more than enough," he said, voice shaking slightly. "But this is asking me to erase part of myself." Melissa's friend across the table tried to interject, "Maybe we should all just..." But Melissa held up her hand to silence them. "No, let's be honest," she said, turning to face the others. "This man has been clinging to a piece of junk car for decades. He values that more than he values helping his daughter grow, expand, live." Edward's face fell. It wasn't just about the car. It was about everything he'd given. The sacrifices, the silent nights of worry, the years he'd spent alone while making sure she never lacked. "Melissa," he said quietly, but she wasn't done. "You think that car represents love and history? It's just metal, rust and gas. Meanwhile, I'm your only child, and you're letting me drown in missed opportunities because you can't let go of a toy from your past." The other guests began pushing their chairs back slightly, unsure if they should stay or leave. One couple exchanged glances, silently debating whether they should excuse themselves. Edward stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "That toy you speak of, it's where I first told your mother I loved her. It's where your uncle and I spent our last weekend together before he got sick. And it's the last thing I have that reminds me of who I used to be, before I gave everything to make sure you'd never have to struggle." The words landed like a stone. Melissa's face twitched, but she didn't soften. And then she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Then maybe you should have loved it more than me." The sting of those words hit harder than any scream. Edward blinked, stunned. Around them, the table had gone completely still. No one moved. No one breathed. That was the moment when something broke, not just in Edward's heart, but in the room itself, and it wasn't over yet. The room was frozen in stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. Edward stood at the head of the table, still reeling from Melissa's cutting words. His breath was shallow, hands trembling slightly at his sides. The pain in his chest was sharper than any he'd felt before. Not physical, but the kind that makes you feel like you've suddenly aged years in a single second. He looked at his daughter, not with anger, but deep sorrow. "I'm sorry you see me this way," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But I won't sell the car. I won't erase my memories for a vacation you'll forget in 6 months." His refusal was calm, dignified, but final. Melissa's face flushed red, not from shame, but from fury. She grabbed her wine glass slowly, eyes burning with indignation. Everyone at the table noticed the tension rising. Someone whispered, "Don't," under their breath. But Melissa was beyond reason. With a sudden, vicious motion, she hurled the contents of her glass straight at her father's face. The deep red liquid splashed across his cheeks, soaking into his shirt and dripping onto the floor. The glass clattered loudly onto the table, untouched but symbolic, like a gavel delivering a final verdict. Gasps filled the room. One guest actually stood up in shock. Someone else muttered, "Jesus Christ." Edward stood still. The wine slowly ran down his face, staining the collar of his light shirt like blood. He didn't flinch, didn't yell, didn't react with outrage. He simply reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, one he always carried, and gently dabbed at his cheeks, his eyes still locked on Melissa. There was no hatred in his expression, just heartbreak. "Are you happy now?" he asked, not accusingly, but with a weariness that cut deeper than any scream. The guests didn't know what to do. Melissa, breathing heavily, seemed to shrink in her seat, as if suddenly aware of the spectacle she had just created. No one spoke. The jazz music in the background was now painfully inappropriate. A woman named Tara, one of Melissa's friends, rose and took a hesitant step toward Edward. "Mr. Collins, I'm so sorry," she said gently, trying to offer him a napkin, though he already had his own. He nodded slightly in appreciation, then looked around at the room, the house his money had helped buy, filled with people he didn't know, witnessing his own daughter dishonor him without a trace of remorse. Without another word, Edward folded his damp handkerchief neatly, placed it in his pocket, and adjusted his jacket. His movements were deliberate, composed, even graceful. Like a man who had decided right then and there that this would be the last time he allowed anyone, even his own daughter, to make him feel small. He looked at Melissa one last time. "I hope your trip brings you the happiness I clearly couldn't," he said. He turned and walked out of the room. The clinking of ice in glasses, the hum of muted conversation, all of it vanished behind him as he stepped into the cold night air. The porch light illuminated the droplets of wine still glistening on his shirt. As he reached his beloved car, he paused, placing a hand on the hood. It felt like the only thing in the world that hadn't betrayed him. Back inside, the silence lingered long after he was gone. Melissa sat staring at her plate, the weight of what had just happened beginning to settle in. But pride kept her from calling after him. One guest whispered to another, "That man raised her," and she did that to him. Someone else began collecting empty glasses to distract from the tension. The party was over, even if no one had officially said so. Outside, Edward sat behind the wheel of his Pontiac, gripping the steering wheel with both hands. He didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he stared out through the windshield, letting the silence calm him. The familiar scent of the leather interior comforted him. This car wasn't just a memory, it was his refuge, and now, more than ever, he needed it. The days that followed were silent. Edward didn't answer the phone. He didn't respond to the dozens of messages Melissa sent him, each one more frantic and apologetic than the last. "Dad, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Please call me," one text read. "We need to talk, Dad. This is tearing me apart." But Edward kept the phone turned off. He didn't want to hear her voice. He didn't want to listen to more empty promises, more manipulations. He had reached his limit. Every time he looked at the phone, a small voice inside urged him to pick up, but each time he put it back down. The car, the memories, they were all he had left now. And that was enough. There were no more excuses, no more guilt. He wasn't going to let Melissa's selfishness dictate his life any longer. The weight of the wine-soaked betrayal still hung over him like a cloud, heavy and suffocating. In the days that followed, news of the dinner spread quickly through their family and friends. The story made its way across social media, first in hushed tones, then loud like wildfire. Some people tried to defend Melissa, claiming that she had a point, that Edward should let go of the past and help his daughter move forward. But most were shocked and disappointed by her behavior. "How could she do that to her own father?" they whispered. "He's always been there for her." Edward, in the privacy of his home, heard the rumors. He didn't need to be told. He saw the sympathy in the eyes of the few family members who still reached out. They didn't say much, but he could tell what they were thinking. No one blamed him for what happened, but that didn't make the pain of losing Melissa any easier. Every call, every text from old friends seemed like a reminder of the relationship he had once thought unbreakable. But he ignored them all. No more compromises, no more bending to her whims. He had spent a lifetime bending, giving, sacrificing, and now, at the end of it all, he was left with nothing but the regret of being a pawn in her self-centered game. So, Edward chose silence. He chose distance. His small apartment, which had always felt too lonely, now felt like a fortress. In the evenings, instead of calling her, he took to walking around the neighborhood. The streets were quieter than they used to be, and the houses on his block all looked the same. Yet each house he passed reminded him of a time when his family felt complete. But now there was no one waiting at the door, no calls asking about his day. The emptiness had settled in like an old friend, comfortable in its familiarity. Melissa's calls became more desperate. "Dad, why are you doing this to me?" One voicemail began. "You can't just shut me out. I need you. You're all I have left." She sent text after text, each more pleading than the last. Yet each time Edward read her words, his resolve grew stronger. The guilt that had once haunted him now felt more like a distant echo. As the weeks passed, Edward began to feel the weight of his decision lift. His days, once filled with worrying over Melissa's well-being, were now filled with peace, something he hadn't known for years. He began to go on long walks, explore parks, and visit the small coffee shop he used to frequent. There were no more calls to interrupt his mornings, no more requests for money or help. It was just him, the car, and the life he was slowly starting to rebuild. Melissa, meanwhile, continued to spiral. Her social media posts became more erratic, filled with angry rants about how unfair life was. "Everyone says I'm spoiled, but no one sees how hard I work," she wrote in one post. "I'm so tired of being treated like I don't deserve anything." But with every word, she seemed to lose more of the respect of those who had once been close to her. She had burned bridges, including the one with the man who had always been there for her. Edward didn't check her posts anymore. He didn't need to. His world had shrunk in a way that felt like liberation. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just his world that had shrunk. He had lost Melissa, the daughter he had given everything to. And though he would never say it aloud, a small part of him still missed her, still wished things could have been different. But for now, he was content with the peace that came from making the hardest choice he had ever made. As the days dragged on, Edward found himself thinking more and more about the offer he had turned down just weeks before. It had come to him unexpectedly during a quiet afternoon at the local car show. A man, a collector with a polished suit and a wealth of enthusiasm for vintage cars, had approached him with a proposition. "I've been looking for a GTO like yours for years," the man had said, admiring the curves of Edward's prized Pontiac. "I'm willing to pay you top dollar for it. It's a rare find, especially in this condition." At the time, Edward had brushed it off. He'd thanked the man, politely of course, but the idea of parting with the car felt unthinkable. It wasn't just the value, it was the connection, the history, the legacy. He couldn't imagine a world where that car wasn't sitting in his garage, gleaming like a piece of his soul. It was all he had left of William, his late brother. It was more than just a possession. It was a symbol of his past, of the love and work they had shared. But as the days passed after the confrontation with Melissa, the thought of the collector's offer started to linger. The wine-stained shirt, the cold words, the sense of being discarded, all of it weighed heavily on him. The Pontiac had once been a symbol of pride and joy, but now, after what had happened with his daughter, it felt like an anchor, dragging him deeper into loneliness and regret. Edward found himself sitting in the garage late one evening, staring at the car. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the background was the only sound in the house, punctuated by the occasional creak of the floorboards. He ran his hand along the cool metal, as if seeking some comfort from its familiar shape, but instead of the sense of warmth he had once felt, he felt a cold emptiness. The car was no longer a source of pride, but of bitterness. He thought about the trip Melissa had wanted, the experiences she could have had, the life she could have built with her own hard work, without leaning on him. He remembered how she had asked him to sell the car, how she had dismissed his feelings, his memories. It was in that moment of silence, looking at the car, that he realized he had nothing left to lose. The collector had been offering a significant sum, a price far beyond what Edward could have ever dreamed of getting for the car, more than enough to cover the money he had lost in helping Melissa over the years. More than enough to secure his own future, to do what he wanted with the remaining years of his life. But could he really sell it? Could he really part with the last piece of his history, the last connection to the family he had lost? After another long moment, Edward sighed and stood up from his chair, wiping his hands on his pants. He reached for his phone. The decision had been made. Maybe it wasn't about the car anymore. Maybe it was about reclaiming his life, about taking control of the future that had seemed so far out of reach. He scrolled through the messages, finally finding the name of the collector. Without hesitating, he tapped out a message. "I've changed my mind. Let's talk." It was a difficult message to send, but it was also a necessary one. Edward knew the car was worth a lot, but it wasn't the money he was after. It was the chance to rebuild, to take back the pieces of his life that had been taken from him, to stop feeling like he was at the mercy of those he loved. As soon as he pressed send, he felt a strange relief wash over him. He didn't feel happy about selling the car, but he felt something close to peace. It was a step forward, a step into a new chapter. Maybe it wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long while, Edward felt like he was finally making a decision for himself, without anyone's approval, without anyone's expectations. Edward's hands shook slightly as he dialed the number. The collector's name flashed on the screen, the same man he'd brushed off just a few weeks ago. It felt surreal, like a step into unknown territory. When the phone picked up, the collector's voice was polite, but there was a certain sharpness to it, a business-like eagerness that reminded Edward just how much value the car held. "I'm glad you reconsidered," the man said, his voice smooth and confident. "The GTO is a rare beauty. I'm prepared to make an offer that I think will work for both of us. Let's get the paperwork sorted." Edward agreed, his words simple but firm. "Let's do it." He hung up the phone and exhaled, feeling the weight of the decision settle heavily on his chest. It wasn't the price that bothered him. It was the idea of parting with something that had once felt irreplaceable. Over the next few days, the transaction moved forward swiftly. The car was appraised, the paperwork drawn up, and the collector transferred a sum into Edward's account that would have set most people up for a lifetime of comfort. The amount was staggering, a sum that could change his life completely. For a brief moment, Edward allowed himself to imagine what he could do with the money: a new house, travel, maybe a few luxuries he had never allowed himself. But as he sat in his small living room, looking out the window at the street that had been his home for so many years, Edward realized something. The money wasn't what he needed. What he needed was freedom. Freedom from the guilt that had kept him tethered to Melissa's demands. Freedom from the years of sacrificing his own well-being for others. The sum that now sat in his bank account wasn't just a monetary value. It was a chance to reclaim his life. Edward had always lived with the idea of putting others first. Whether it was his wife, his brother, or Melissa, he'd spent decades being the reliable one, the provider, the fixer. But now, with the money from the car, he understood that it was time to invest in something else, something that would bring him peace, not just comfort. He transferred a portion of the money into a new savings account, earmarked for future expenses, and then took a portion to donate. There were charities for the elderly, for people like him who had given their lives to others and now faced loneliness in their later years. He had always wanted to help, but never had the resources. Now he could make a difference. He could give without hesitation, without the strings attached that had always been tied to his own family. The remaining funds, however, were put into a small farm he'd been eyeing for some time. It was a modest place, surrounded by fields and quiet woods, a sanctuary. Edward had always dreamed of a life away from the noise and complications of the city, a place where he could live simply, peacefully, and on his own terms. The decision to buy the farm wasn't just about comfort. It was about taking control of his future in a way he hadn't been able to before. The day he made the transfer was the first time in years that Edward felt truly at peace. The sense of relief was profound. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about what others needed from him. He was thinking about what he needed for himself. It wasn't about luxury. It was about freedom, dignity, and space. A place to breathe and finally live for himself. Melissa's voice echoed in his mind, as it often did these days. Her accusations about the car, her selfish demands, her judgment. He had spent a lifetime putting others first, and he had lost so much in the process. But now, standing on the threshold of this new life, he knew he had made the right decision. It was time for him to put himself first. As the transaction was finalized, Edward sat in his favorite chair by the window, looking out at the world with a newfound sense of calm. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. The road ahead might be uncertain, but it was his road, and that in itself was enough. Edward sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, staring at the map spread before him. The roads and rivers of Italy, France, and Japan lay in front of him like an open invitation. These were the places he had always dreamed of visiting, but had put off for decades. Life had always been about work, about taking care of others, about making sure Melissa had everything she needed. But now there was nothing holding him back. The world was vast, and it was finally his to explore. He had always admired the romantic notion of wandering through the streets of Rome, standing beneath the towering spires of the Eiffel Tower, or watching the cherry blossoms bloom in Japan. But these dreams had always seemed impractical, just fleeting thoughts in the back of his mind. Now, with the money from the sale of his car and the decision to finally live for himself, Edward could make these dreams a reality. He wasn't just planning a trip, he was planning a new life. For the first time in years, Edward wasn't calculating what he could afford based on what others needed. He wasn't wondering if he had enough to send to Melissa or whether he could cover a bill for a family member. It was just about him, and the possibilities felt endless. He chose Italy first, drawn by the countryside, the art, and the food. He wanted to see Venice, Florence, and the vineyards of Tuscany. It felt right to start in a place that had always been synonymous with beauty and culture. Next, he planned France. He had always been enamored with Paris, the city of lights, the cafes that lined the cobbled streets, and the history that whispered through every monument. Edward's wife, Margaret, had always talked about visiting Paris someday. Now, he would do it for both of them. He would stand on the banks of the Seine and remember her. It felt like a fitting tribute to her memory. And then Japan, a place Edward had always dreamed of, fascinated by its culture, its history, and its breathtaking landscapes. He imagined walking through the ancient temples of Kyoto, watching the bustling life in Tokyo, and perhaps even taking a quiet moment under the shadow of Mount Fuji. These were dreams he had carried quietly for years, and now they were finally within his grasp. But before he left, Edward knew there was one last thing he had to do, something that would give him peace. He took a portion of the money from the car sale and donated it to charity. He chose organizations that helped the elderly, who had been forgotten by their families, and others that supported causes close to his heart. He remembered his late wife, Margaret, who had always been compassionate and charitable, and his brother William, who had shared those values. This was a tribute to their legacy. As he wrote the donation checks, Edward felt a sense of closure, as if he were finally closing the chapter of his life that had been filled with obligations and sacrifices for others. Now, with the world in front of him, he could begin to live in the way he had always dreamed. The journey wasn't just about travel, it was about rediscovering himself. The night before his flight to Italy, Edward sat in the living room, his favorite chair creaking under his weight. He looked around the room that had once felt too quiet, too empty. Now it was filled with a new kind of energy. The thought of all the places he would soon see, the adventures that awaited, filled him with an excitement he hadn't felt in years. He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the smell of the Italian countryside, the sound of waves crashing on French beaches, the taste of fresh sushi in Japan. He thought of Melissa then, for the first time in a while. He wondered if she ever thought about him, if she regretted the way things had ended, but he didn't dwell on it. He couldn't. She had made her choices, and he had made his. He had forgiven her in his heart, but he could no longer be tied to her decisions. Now, he was living for himself, and that, for the first time in his life, felt right. As the plane took off the next day, Edward looked out the window at the receding city below. His life was beginning anew, a life filled with possibility, exploration, and peace, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of freedom. He was no longer just a provider, a caretaker, or a martyr. He was just Edward, a man free to live the way he had always dreamed. Months passed, and as Edward explored the world, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Italy, France, and Japan had become more than just vacation spots. They were places where he rediscovered himself, where the weight of his past seemed to evaporate with each new sunrise. He sent postcards to friends, but none to Melissa. The distance between them had grown thick, and for the first time, he wasn't burdened by guilt. But back home, Melissa's life was not unfolding as she had imagined. The glamorous trip she'd planned, the expensive dinners, the designer clothes, it all seemed to be crumbling around her. The bills piled up, and her job at the marketing firm wasn't enough to cover her lifestyle. Her friends, once a constant source of support, had begun to distance themselves as they saw her overextended, not the carefree woman she had pretended to be. One evening, as Edward was savoring a quiet dinner in Kyoto, his phone buzzed. He picked it up to see a message from an unknown number. The message was short but direct. "Dad, we need to talk. I've been having some trouble. Can you please call me?" Edward paused, looking at the phone for a long moment. His heart didn't race, but the message tugged at something deep inside him. He hadn't heard from her in months, and his first instinct was to ignore it. But something inside told him to at least listen. He dialed her number. The phone rang for several moments before she picked up. "Dad?" Melissa's voice sounded strained, tired. "I know it's been a while, but I really need to talk to you. Things aren't going well. I've made some mistakes, and now I'm in over my head." Edward sat back in his chair, looking out the window at the serene landscape before him. He could hear the urgency in her voice, but there was also something else. The same entitlement, the same self-centered tone that had caused so much pain before. "What's going on, Melissa?" he asked quietly. She hesitated for a moment before responding, her voice cracking slightly. I've been struggling financially. I bought too many things on credit, took on loans for my business, and now I'm facing mounting debt. I can't pay everything back. I need help, Dad. I don't know what to do." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Edward felt a pang of sympathy. But the reality of the situation hit him. This wasn't about needing help with a job loss or an emergency. It was the same pattern, the same reckless choices that had led her here in the first place. He could almost see her, sitting in her designer apartment, surrounded by luxury items she didn't need, pretending it would last forever. "I told you before, Melissa," Edward said slowly, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not going to bail you out anymore. I can't keep fixing your mistakes. You have to take responsibility for your actions." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I know, Dad," Melissa finally whispered. I didn't realize how much I was asking of you, how much I was expecting you to give. I've been so selfish. I'm sorry." Her voice was soft now, almost breaking. Edward closed his eyes, sighing deeply. "Melissa, I've given you everything I could," he said, the words heavy. "But I can't keep doing this. You have to stand on your own 2 feet now." You can't keep asking others to fix your problems. There was a long pause before she spoke again, her voice barely audible. I understand. I'll figure it out, Dad. But I really miss you. Edward hung up the phone, feeling a mix of emotions. He wanted to help her, wanted to make it all right again, but he knew he couldn't. He had spent too many years enabling her, sacrificing his own peace for her comfort. This time, it was her turn to make the difficult choices. And as much as it hurt, he had to let her face the consequences of her own decisions. Weeks passed before Melissa finally reached out again, and this time, she was more direct. Edward's phone buzzed with a new message, this one more urgent than the last. I need to see you, Dad. I've been thinking a lot and I know I messed up, but I need to talk to you about the money from the car. Edward's stomach tightened, the familiar knot of discomfort returning. He knew where this was going. He didn't answer right away. The air in his apartment felt thick, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for him to make a choice. The choice was simple, really. He could see her again, give in, let her have what she wanted. Or he could stand firm and make the final break. For a long moment he stared at the message, weighing the costs of each decision. Finally, he replied, I'm not giving you any more money, Melissa. We've been through this. It's not going to change. She didn't take long to respond. I'm not asking for more money, Dad. I'm asking for my fair share. You got a huge sum from selling the car. That's my inheritance, my right. You owe me. The words were like a slap. She was still stuck in the same mindset, still seeing him as a bank, as someone to exploit. Edward closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath. He'd given her so much over the years, and she had always expected more. The years of sacrifice, of working himself to the bone to provide for her, had turned into a string of demands. Endless, selfish demands. Now, even after all this time, she was still demanding. And this time, it was too much. He picked up the phone again, typing out a response. Melissa, I spent years giving you everything I could. Every dime I had, every ounce of energy, every last bit of patience. And what did I get in return? You throwing wine in my face, insulting everything I've ever worked for. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I've always been there for you. But now, I'm finally giving something to myself. Her response was almost instantaneous. What? You're just going to keep everything for yourself? After all I've done for you? After everything I've sacrificed for you? Her voice, even through text, was full of righteous anger. She wasn't seeing the truth. She wasn't seeing how everything had always been about her. Edward's fingers hovered over the keys, the words forming in his mind. I'm not giving you any more, Melissa. I'm giving something to myself. Freedom from your greed. Freedom from the endless expectations, the constant demands, the guilt. He pressed send before he could second-guess himself. He felt a strange relief, a weight lifting from his chest. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't even about her. It was about him reclaiming his life, his right to be free from her manipulation. And for the first time in a long while, Edward felt like he had made the right decision. Minutes passed, and still, she didn't reply. Edward stared at the screen, knowing this conversation would be the one that defined the rest of their relationship. She would either accept it and move on, or she would cut him out forever. But no matter what, he knew one thing. He couldn't keep sacrificing his own happiness for hers. A few hours later, Melissa called him. She was crying this time, her voice shaky. Please, Dad, I don't know what I'm doing. I thought you'd always be there to help me. But now I realize I've been wrong. Edward's heart softened, but he didn't let the flood of guilt wash over him. I'm always here for you, Melissa, but you have to do this on your own. You have to start taking responsibility for your choices. She was quiet for a long time before replying. I understand, Dad. I just wanted you to be proud of me. Edward closed his eyes, his voice steady. I am proud of you. But it's time you started making your own way. I can't keep doing this for you. The line went silent. There was nothing more to say. Edward sat behind the wheel of a rented convertible, the engine purring softly as it powered down the winding roads of the Italian coastline. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the Mediterranean Sea. The wind tousled his hair as he drove, the cool breeze brushing against his face, carrying with it the scent of salt water and distant pine trees. He smiled, the weight of the past months lifting from his shoulders with every mile he put between himself and everything he had left behind. The road stretched before him, a ribbon of asphalt winding through cliffs and hills, leading him further into the unknown. It was the first time in years that Edward felt truly free, free from guilt, free from obligation, and free from the ties that had once bound him to a life he had not chosen for himself. The world was his, and for the first time in a long time, he was going where he wanted, on his own terms. As the car turned a sharp corner, Edward slowed down, letting his fingers lightly brush the steering wheel. He thought about the past, about the sacrifices he had made, the years spent putting others first, always giving, always giving. But it wasn't just the car that had changed his life. It was the realization that he had spent so much time looking outward that he had forgotten to look inward. He had spent so long trying to fix everything for everyone else, and in doing so, he had neglected himself. The sound of the engine seemed to fade into the background as Edward looked out at the horizon, the vastness of the ocean stretching out before him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from something. He was moving toward something. He wasn't trying to fix his daughter's mistakes or hold on to memories that no longer served him. He was simply living, and that, for him, was enough. He thought about Melissa again, but the thoughts didn't hurt as much. He wondered if she was starting to understand, starting to realize that real growth came not from taking, but from giving and earning. He hoped she would find her way, just as he had. It wasn't his responsibility anymore. The lesson had to come from her, just as the lesson of self-worth had come from him. The car slowed as Edward pulled over at a lookout point, the view stretching out across the sea. He took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping out onto the stone pavement. The warmth of the sun still lingered, and the evening sky was painted with hues of orange and purple. Edward leaned against the car, his hands resting on the edge, looking out at the vast ocean before him. He felt small, but in the best possible way. He didn't need the car anymore. He didn't need the mansion, or the luxuries, or the constant expectations from his family. What he had found, what he had reclaimed, was far more valuable. Peace, freedom, the ability to be his own person, without the weight of the past constantly pressing down on him. And that, he knew, was priceless. As he stood there, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, a sense of quiet satisfaction washed over him. He had learned the hardest lesson of all. Respect and gratitude were worth more than anything material. His memories, his experiences, were his own, and no one could take them from him. Not Melissa, not anyone. They were his, to keep. Edward smiled softly as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the sky darkening in shades of violet and gold. His heart felt lighter than it had in years, and he realized that it wasn't just about the trips or the money. It was about finding himself again, about rediscovering the person he had lost along the way, a person who could live for himself, for the first time in a long time. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Edward slid back into the car and continued his drive down the coast. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that whatever came next, he was ready. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he needed to be, on his own path, driving toward a future he had finally chosen for himself.